There is a window of time so precise, so narrow, and so loaded with consequence that once you see it, you cannot explain it away with coincidence. Between 1750 and 1780, something happened to the world. Not slowly, not gradually, the way historians like to describe the movement of civilizations as long rolling tides of change. It happened sharply. It happened within a single human lifetime. And what was left standing on the other side of that 30-year window was a financial architecture so total, so perfectly interlocked, that it would come to govern every nation, every resource, and every human being on the planet for the next 250 years. The same 30-year window produced the Rothschild dynasty, the Baring family, the Hope and Company network, the foundational charters of central banking across the European continent, the financing of the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and every major war that followed, all of it compressed into 3 decades. And the world those banking families inherited? The maps that preceded them told a very different story about who had been here before. Maps printed and circulated across Europe in the early and mid-18th century showed a civilization called Grand Tartary occupying a territory so vast it beggared comprehension. It stretched from the Ural Mountains east across the entirety of the Eurasian landmass, south into what we now call Central Asia, and according to some cartographers, across the northern Pacific and into the upper reaches of the North American continent. It was not a vague or speculative designation. It appeared on French maps, German maps, Dutch maps, British maps. It appeared on the maps of royal geographers employed by the most powerful courts in Europe. It had subdivisions, administrative regions, named cities and trade routes: Muscovite Tartary, Mughal Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Independent Tartary. Each labelled, each distinct, each carrying the weight of a civilization that had been recognized and documented for generations. And then it stopped appearing. Not all at once. The disappearance was gradual enough to seem natural, the way a fading memory seems natural if you are not looking carefully. By the 1790s, the vast labelled territory of Grand Tartary had been absorbed into the expanding Russian Empire on some maps and simply removed from others. The administrative subdivisions vanished. The named interior cities disappeared from cartographic records. What had been described for more than a century as one of the great territorial entities of the known world was replaced by empty space, by wilderness, by lands reclassified as uninhabited. The last major cartographic representations of Grand Tartary as a coherent named civilization clustered between approximately 1750 and 1780. These are the final decades in which European cartographers, working from sources they considered authoritative, still drew the old world in its older shape. After that threshold, the shape of the world changes. The old designations are dropped. A new geography replaces them, and in the same 30 years, the banking dynasties of the modern West are born. This is not a footnote in the historical record. This is the central question that the historical record has spent 250 years refusing to ask. Mayer Amschel Rothschild was born in Frankfurt in 1744, the son of a money changer who operated from the Jewish ghetto on the Judengasse. By the 1760s, Mayer had established himself as a dealer in rare coins and antiques, cultivating a relationship with the court of Landgrave William IX of Hesse-Kassel. By the 1770s, he had formalized his banking operations. By the 1780s, he had become the primary financial agent of one of the wealthiest royal families in Europe, managing military subsidies paid by the British Crown to Hessian mercenary troops. The fortune that would eventually be dispatched to London, Paris, Vienna, Naples, and Frankfurt through 5 sons was seeded in this precise historical window. John Baring arrived in England from Bremen in 1717, but it was his sons, Francis and John, who transformed the family wool trade into a financial institution. Baring Brothers and Company was formally established in 1762. Within a decade, it was involved in financing trade across the Atlantic and negotiating government bonds. By the end of the century, it would help finance the Louisiana Purchase and hold positions of influence in the treasuries of multiple European states. Hope and Company of Amsterdam, which had operated in various forms since the early 18th century, became during the 1760s and 1770s the most powerful private banking house in the world. Its reach extended to the financing of the Russian imperial court, the Bourbon monarchy of France, and the early infrastructure of the United States. The partners of Hope and Company were present at the financial negotiations that shaped every major political settlement of the late 18th century. 3 institutions, 3 founding windows, all of them clustering in the same 30 years that cartographers across Europe were drawing the last maps of the old world's largest named civilization. What does the historical mainstream say about this? It says it is coincidence. It says the second half of the 18th century was simply the right moment for private banking to mature, that the conditions of European commerce had ripened, that the legal frameworks for credit and debt had evolved, that the demand from expanding colonial empires created the opportunity. It says Meyer Rothschild was a brilliant man who recognized a moment. It says the Barings were industrious merchants who made smart bets. It says the partners of Hope and Company were sophisticated financiers who understood the interconnection of sovereign debt and private capital. All of this is true. None of it explains the timing. Because the timing is not about commerce reaching maturity. The timing corresponds precisely to an event or a series of events that the historical record declines to name. Something happened to the world between 1750 and 1780. The maps changed. The named civilizations of the previous era disappeared from cartographic documentation. And in the space those civilizations had occupied, new powers organized themselves. New financial architectures were laid down, and new dynasties took possession of the mechanisms of credit that would define the next era of history. To understand what the maps were showing, you have to go back further. The cartographic tradition that documented Grand Tartary did not begin in a moment of speculation or fantasy. It was inherited from a continuous stream of geographic intelligence stretching back to the medieval period and intensifying through the 16th and 17th centuries. The Jesuit missionaries who travelled through Central Asia in the 1600s sent reports back to Rome and to the royal courts of Europe describing populated territories, organised governance structures, and architectural works on a scale that rivaled anything in Western Europe. The Dutch cartographers of the Golden Age, who were among the most rigorous and commercially motivated mapmakers in history, incorporated that intelligence into their atlases because their merchants needed it to be accurate. The French royal geographers of the early 18th century, men like Guillaume de Lisle and his successors, were funded by the crown precisely because cartographic accuracy had direct commercial and military value. These were not dreamers drawing fictions, they were professionals drawing what their sources told them existed. Guillaume de Lisle's early 18th century maps of Tartary were among the most sophisticated geographic documents of their era. They showed not just the outline of the territory, but internal divisions, river systems, and named settlements. Johann Baptist Homann, the imperial cartographer of the Holy Roman Empire, published maps throughout the early decades of the 18th century that treated Tartary as a continuous and substantial geographic and political reality. Nicolas Sanson's earlier cartographic work, foundational to the entire French tradition, had established the subdivisions of Tartary with a specificity that implied documentary sources, not invention. The territory being described was, on paper, one of the largest continuous governed spaces on the planet. Larger than the Russian Empire at the same moment in time, larger than the combined territories of the European colonial powers in their overseas possessions, larger than anything the Western historical narrative attributes to that part of the world in that period, which is why the Western historical narrative does not engage with the cartographic record in any sustained or serious way. What the maps show, in aggregate, is a world that does not match the history we are taught. The history we are taught tells us that Siberia and Central Asia in the 17th and 18th centuries were thinly populated wilderness, gradually being explored and claimed by Russian expansion. The maps do not say this. The maps say something was there, something organized enough, large enough, and persistent enough that professional cartographers from multiple competing European nations documented it with a specificity that implies first-hand or second-hand knowledge of real places. And then it ends. The last group of maps that treat Grand Tartary as a living entity rather than a historical remnant or an absorbed territory clusters in the mid-18th century. After 1780, the cartographic consensus shifts, the old name becomes vestigial, appearing in some documents with qualifications that signal it is now being used in an archaic or historical sense, rather than a contemporary one. Something happened between the maps and the banking dynasties. That is the claim. That the world those dynasties inherited was not a world that had simply been waiting for them. It was a world that had been cleared for them. The Hessian connection to the Rothschild family is worth examining in detail because it carries within it an architecture of war financing that would define the entire subsequent era. Landgrave William IX of Hesse-Kassel was one of the wealthiest men in Europe in the second half of the 18th century. The source of that wealth was not land or agriculture or trade in goods. The source was the hiring out of Hessian soldiers as mercenary forces to foreign powers, most significantly to the British Crown for use in colonial wars, and critically, in the suppression of the American colonial rebellion. The British government paid enormous sums to rent these armies. William needed someone to manage those sums, to invest them, to move them across national borders without triggering the legal complications that direct royal financial activity would have involved. Mayor Rothschild, operating from the Frankfurt ghetto, was the solution. He became the institutional mechanism through which one of the largest concentrations of mercenary war profit in European history was managed, leveraged, and eventually deployed as founding capital for a banking network that would span the continent. This is documented history. What is less often discussed is the broader pattern it represents. The banking dynasties of the late 18th century did not arise from commercial trade reaching a new level of sophistication. They arose from war finance. Every major institution of that founding window was built on the management of sovereign debt incurred through military conflict. The Barings financed the British government's war efforts. Hope and Company financed the French and Russian courts through periods of military expansion and revolutionary upheaval. The Rothschild network, once established, became the primary mechanism through which the costs of the Napoleonic Wars were distributed, managed, and eventually settled. War finance and banking dynasty formation were not parallel developments. They were the same development. The dynasties existed because states needed to fund wars that exceeded their immediate revenues, and the banking families existed to provide that funding in exchange for the institutional privileges, bond monopolies, and central bank charters that would consolidate their long-term power. The question the Tartary framing forces you to ask is this: if a civilization preceded the one these dynasties inherited, and if that civilization was substantial enough to appear on the maps of professional European cartographers across multiple generations, what happened to its wealth? What happened to its financial infrastructure, its accumulated resources, its institutional knowledge of trade and credit? Resources do not disappear. Capital does not vanish. When a civilization falls, its material wealth is absorbed by whatever comes next. The gold and silver of the Aztec Empire did not cease to exist when the Aztec state was destroyed. It was absorbed into the Spanish colonial system. The movable wealth of every conquered civilization in history followed the same pattern. It was transferred, not eliminated. If the civilization that appears on the maps of Grand Tartary was destroyed or displaced in the mid-18th century, the wealth it had accumulated did not disappear. It was absorbed into the financial architecture that replaced it. And the financial architecture that replaced it was built in precisely that window by a small number of banking families whose origins are obscure, whose founding capital has never been fully traced, and whose rise to continental dominance happened with a speed that conventional commercial history struggles to explain. This is not an accusation, it is a structural observation about how the transfer of civilizational wealth works. When empires collapse, the institutions that manage money do not collapse with them. They survive, they adapt, and they attach themselves to the new order. The question is not whether wealth was transferred from the old order to the new. The question is whether the banking families of the 1750 to 1780 window were the mechanism of that transfer, knowingly or otherwise. Adam Weishaupt founded the Order of the Illuminati on May 1, 1776. The date is one that researchers in this field have noted extensively, sharing as it does a calendar year with the American Declaration of Independence and falling within the tight founding window of the banking dynasties. Weishaupt was a professor of law at the University of Ingolstadt in Bavaria, and his stated purpose was the establishment of a secret organization committed to Enlightenment principles, the separation of church and state, and the elimination of superstition and religious influence over public life. These goals were not unusual for an educated European of his era. What made the Illuminati unusual was its structure, its secrecy, and the speed with which it infiltrated the Masonic lodge system, and, through Freemasonry, the financial and political networks of Europe. The connection between the founding of the Illuminati, the establishment of the banking dynasties, and the final disappearance of Grand Tartary from the maps is not a connection that mainstream history acknowledges. It is, in the Tartaria research tradition, understood as a convergence. Not three separate developments that happen to coincide, but a single reorganization of the world's power architecture occurring simultaneously across its financial, cartographic, and institutional dimensions. Whether or not you accept that framing, the convergence itself is real. The dates are not invented. Weishaupt in 1776, the Rothschild Foundation in the 1760s through 1780s, Baring Brothers in 1762, the last coherent maps of Grand Tartary in the mid-century decades, the American Republic in 1776, the French Republic in 1792, the entire architecture of the modern world assembled within a window of 50 years, and the core of that assembly concentrated in the 30 years between 1750 and 1780. The architectural record is another line of inquiry. Across cities of Europe and North America, there is a class of buildings that present a problem for the construction timelines that official history assigns to them. Massive structures of extraordinary technical sophistication, using materials and methods that exceed what we know about the capacities of the workers attributed to their construction dates. The old city halls, the grand cathedrals, the Baroque administrative palaces, the civic buildings of 100 European and American cities, structures supposedly built in a matter of years, using techniques whose replication would challenge modern construction firms. The Tartaria framework proposes that many of these buildings were not constructed in the 18th or 19th centuries. They were already standing. They were inherited. They were the physical residue of the civilization that appears on the maps, retrofitted and claimed by the new order as its own achievements, given construction dates that fit the new historical narrative. The banking dynasties and the architectural inheritance connect in a specific way. The institutions that the banking families built their power through were housed in precisely these buildings. The Bank of England, the great banking houses of Frankfurt, Amsterdam, London, and Paris were established in buildings whose provenance trails off into vague references to earlier structures and earlier uses not clearly identified in the documentary record. The physical infrastructure of the new financial order was, in at least some meaningful sense, the physical infrastructure of the old world, repurposed, renamed, and incorporated into a new narrative. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 is one of the most consequential financial transactions in history, and its banking architecture runs directly through the dynasty window. The United States purchased approximately 828,000 square miles of territory from Napoleon's France for approximately $15 million. The deal was brokered and financed by, on the American side, the London offices of Baring Brothers, and on the French side, the Amsterdam network of Hope and Company. Two of the founding banking dynasties of the 1750 to 1780 window, within a single generation of their establishment, were managing the financial transaction that doubled the size of the United States. The territory being purchased had never been meaningfully administered by France in any substantial way. France had claimed it, ceded it to Spain, reclaimed it, and then sold it within a period of roughly 40 years, none of these transfers involving meaningful physical presence or governance on anything resembling the scale that the territorial claim implied. The financiers of that transaction were managing the final administrative settlement of a world reorganization that had begun in the mid-18th century. They were, in the most literal financial sense, processing the transfer of the old world's assets into the new world's accounts. The Napoleonic Wars, which dominated European history from 1803 to 1815, are the fullest expression of the banking dynasty model in its first generation of operation. Every major European power engaged in those conflicts financed its military operations through the mechanisms the banking dynasties had built. The Rothschild network, by this point operating from London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna and Naples, through 5 brothers managing 5 separate but coordinated houses, was the primary institutional vehicle through which sovereign debt was issued. Bond markets were managed and the costs of war were distributed across the financial systems of multiple nations simultaneously. Nathan Mayer Rothschild in London became, during the Napoleonic period, the most powerful private financier in the world. His ability to move capital across national borders with a speed that exceeded anything available to governments, his intelligence network that is said to have brought him news of Waterloo before the British government received official confirmation, and his understanding of how sovereign debt markets responded to news of victory or defeat, made him the defining financial figure of the era. By the time the wars ended and the Congress of Vienna sat down to redraw the map of Europe in 1815, the Rothschild network was not a peripheral actor, it was a central one. The map of Europe produced by the Congress of Vienna looks nothing like the map of Europe produced by the Congress's predecessors. The old designations, the old entities, the old territorial arrangements that had persisted for generations were replaced by a cleaner, more rationalized political geography. The settlement of 1815 is, from the Tartaria perspective, the final administrative completion of the reorganization that began in the 1750 to 1780 window. The banking dynasties had been born, the old cartographic civilizations had been erased, the new nation-states had been constituted, and in 1815 those nation-states were reorganized into the political map that would, with modifications, persist through most of the 19th and into the 20th century. The central banks are the institutional legacy of this entire process. The Bank of England, the Banque de France established in 1800 under Napoleon, the Austrian National Bank established in 1816, the major central banking institutions of the Western world were all chartered in the decades immediately following the 1750 to 1780 window. They were chartered by governments that had financed their wars through the banking dynasties. They were staffed by networks connected to those same dynasties, and they established in permanent institutional form the principle that sovereign governments would manage their finances through debt issued to private banking institutions rather than through direct monetary creation. This principle, which seems natural and inevitable to people raised inside the system it created, was not natural or inevitable. It was a choice, a specific institutional design choice made in a specific historical window by a specific set of actors with a specific interest in the outcome. The governments of the pre-1750 world had not all operated on this principle. The alternative, the principle of sovereign monetary creation without private intermediaries, had existed and had been practiced. It was not replaced by the central banking model because it was less efficient. It was replaced because the banking dynasties, newly established and newly powerful, had an overwhelming structural interest in the replacement. What the central banking model does at its most fundamental level is guarantee that the cost of government is always greater than the revenue of government, because borrowing requires interest, and interest requires perpetual debt service, and perpetual debt service requires perpetual borrowing, which requires perpetual interest. It is a closed loop of permanent dependency, and the banking dynasties of the 1750 to 1780 window were the architects of that loop. The world that preceded them, whatever it was, whatever the map showed, operated under different principles. The evidence for this is not only in the cartographic anomalies, it is in the material record of civilizations that built on scales of ambition and resource mobilization that the debt-financed nation-state model cannot explain. The great infrastructure projects, the vast civic monuments, the enormous agricultural and hydraulic systems that appear in the archaeological record of the pre-1750 world did not require an international banking system to be built. They required organizational capacity, technical knowledge, and access to material resources. That organizational capacity, that knowledge, and that resource access did not belong to the banking dynasties. It belonged to whatever civilization the banking dynasties displaced. This is the core of the Tartaria hypothesis, as it applies to banking history. Not that the banking dynasties were uniquely villainous actors in a world of otherwise innocent institutions, but that they were the institutional vehicle through which the wealth and infrastructure of a preceding civilization was absorbed, consolidated, and redirected into the service of a new order that operated on different principles toward different ends for the benefit of a much smaller class of people. The 30-year window between 1750 and 1780 is where that transition concentrates. Before it, the old world persists on the maps and in the fragments of institutional memory that the new order did not entirely succeed in erasing. After it, the new world is fully operational. Its banking architecture in place, its cartographic record redrawn, its history being written by the institutions that will manage the telling of that history for the next 2.5 centuries. There are researchers who have spent years inside this question, following the thread from the cartographic anomalies to the banking founding dates to the architectural inheritance to the population records of the mid-18th century. The population records are themselves a line of inquiry. The census data, the church records, the administrative documents that would allow a reconstruction of the demographic picture in the territories that disappear from the maps in the 1750 to 1780 window are incomplete in ways that seem not accidental. The gaps are concentrated precisely in Siberia, Central Asia, and the upper Pacific coast of North America. Exactly the regions where Grand Tartary was most extensively documented by earlier cartographers. The orphan trains of the 19th century, the massive institutional movement of children across the American continent through mid-century into the late 1800s, are sometimes cited in this context as evidence of a population replacement program following a demographic catastrophe. Hundreds of thousands of children, described as orphans or abandoned, moved from eastern cities to western territories over decades. The explanatory framework offered by official history, that they were the overflow of urban immigrant poverty, does not account for the scale or the speed. The banking dynasties financed the settlement of those territories. The Barings and their successors were central to the bond issuances that funded American Western expansion. The Rothschild network managed European capital flows into American infrastructure, the railroads, the canals, the land developments that tied the continent together into a single economic unit. They were not passive investors, they were active architects of the settlement model, managing at the financial level the final phase of a civilizational transition that had begun in the cartographic and institutional record of the 1750 to 1780 window. The question is not whether this happened. The question is whether you are willing to follow the evidence to where it leads and what you are prepared to accept about the shape of the world you were born into when you get there. Look at the maps, not the maps you were shown in school, the maps that present the world as a natural and inevitable arrangement of nation-states and territories. Look at the earlier maps, the maps from 1720, 1740, 1750. Look at what they name in the spaces that your school maps left blank or labelled as wilderness. Look at the size of what is named, look at the specificity of the naming, look at how many different national cartographic traditions, French, German, Dutch, British, all converging on the same designations for the same territories across the same decades. Then look at the founding dates of the banking dynasties. Write them down. Baring Brothers, 1762. The formalization of the Rothschild network, 1760s through 1780s. Hope and Company at the height of its continental power, the same decades. The chartering of the major central banks, the 2 decades after 1780. Write those dates next to the dates on the last maps that show the old world. The gap between those 2 columns of numbers is the most important gap in the history of the modern world. It is the space in which something ended and something began. The something that ended does not have a name in the history we are taught. The something that began has names we all know. Rothschild, Baring, Hope, the Bank of England in its modern form, the central banking system that governs the planet. The old world had its map, the new world had its bankers. And between the last map and the first dynasty, there is a silence in the historical record that no mainstream institution has ever seriously attempted to explain. That silence is where the real history lives. What we call modernity, the system of nation-states, central banks, sovereign debt, and institutional finance that structures every dimension of human life on this planet, did not arise from nothing. It arose from something. It arose in place of something. The maps tell us something was there. The banking founding dates tell us something replaced it. The architectural record tells us the replacement used what the predecessor had built. And the 30-year window tells us the transition was not gradual. It was decisive. The world was reorganized, the maps changed, the banks appeared. And the history that was written afterward was written by the institutions the banks financed. in the interest of the order those banks created, about a past that was shaped to make the present seem inevitable. Nothing about this present was inevitable. It was designed. The design has a date range, and the date range corresponds exactly to the final years of the old world's last map.